Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to another All Things Avennia. My name's Eli Travers, and we are in week three. Yes, week three of Washington Wine Month here in March 2021. Today we're going to be talking about the first AVA, the first American Viticultural Area in Washington, Yakima Valley. And so to start, though, we're gonna dive in a little bit to the history, the geography and geology of Eastern Washington, because it's going to have a big impact on what we talk about. So, Yakima Valley, and you'll notice this is the same picture of Red Willow Vineyard that I had on last week's Pioneers, because we're going to talk more about Red Willow this time around. There we go. Oh, here we go. So, in general, our Washington geography and geology lesson is going to cover a couple major themes here. So our northerly latitude, the concept of diurnal shifts or a diurnal swing, rain shadow effect, and then a bunch about soils, including the three main types of soil we have here: volcanic, alluvial deposits from glacial floods, and then wind-blown loess. And then you'll see the following slides are used with permission from Washington State Wine Commission, which is great. If you don't know, Washington State Wine is our marketing and branch of the business or the industry here, and they do lots to help with education, promotion for the industry at large. So I want to thank the commission for letting me use this. They have so many great resources and maps and pictures. So some of them will be used here. So first, we have our perfect climate and region for growing grapes. So we are on the 46th parallel, so pretty northern latitude, but it's right on par with some of the best wine growing regions in Europe. So you can see right around the Rhone Valley, Burgundy, some parts of northern Italy, even Bordeaux. And the main thing that, or why that's important, is that we're in the sweet spot where the angle the sun is to us, we get the most sunlight during our growing season. So we get super long days of sunlight, which is what we need for grapes to grow well in Eastern Washington. And then the other part that helps those grapes grow but not grow too fast is this concept, or this thing called diurnal shift. So the diurnal range is just the difference between your high daytime temperature and then your low nighttime temperature. And it explains the gap between the two. And you need both those things to ripen grapes in a great way. You need warm temperatures and a lot of sunlight during the day for sugar maturation and for sugar accumulation. But then you need the cooler nighttime temperatures to preserve acidity and to stop some of that ripening process, to preserve freshness in the wine and also preserve some of those aromas. Washington has some of the most extreme diurnal shifts from any wine region in the world. I mean, we're talking a range of 35 to 47 degrees between day and night. So that's not 47 degrees. That's the difference of 47 degrees. And you'll see, during that growing season, July and August, it'll be in the low to mid 90s during the day, but then it drops down into the 50s at night. And then that slowly tapers off as we get close to harvest. And it's just one of the things that makes Washington a really unique place to grow grapes, because again, we're in a semi-arid desert, and so that temperature change helps it not just get completely overwhelmed with heat accumulation and with heat units and having overripe grapes. So that nighttime temperature is very crucial. But then the other part of being in a desert is rain. So I love this diagram. This is a way for you to see why people think of Washington, they think of Seattle as being super rainy, and it is. But where we're growing most of our grapes in this state, we don't get a lot of rain at all. And so this is because we have our two mountain ranges along the west coast, the Olympics in the Olympic Peninsula, and then the Cascades that block most of the moisture coming in from the Pacific Ocean, and then it condenses into rain. So you have 140 inches a year in there's actually a rainforest on the Olympic Peninsula. In Seattle here, we have a little less because of that, so we're around 40 inches. But then most of that condenses into snow and rain in the Cascades, so that by the time you get into Yakima Valley, we're talking 6 to 8 inches of rain a year. And so because of that, we are also more interested in irrigation. So if you think back to last week, we've needed irrigation in Eastern Washington in order to make agriculture possible and viticulture. And just to compare, so you can see the difference between some of these regions, Bordeaux, a maritime region, has a little more rain, about 22 inches. a year. Even Napa has a little less, but much more than we have. 7 inches is your average in Columbia Valley. So not a lot of rain. And honestly, most of those inches of rain in Columbia Valley happens in January or February. So it's not even when we need it in the vineyard. But then we get to geology. So like I said, Eastern Washington, it's a fascinating landscape. I've driven through, I remember driving through it the first time moving to Seattle and just being, it's just amazing. You come out of the mountains, the Rocky Mountains in Montana and Idaho, and you come down and you're just on this wide, flat, deserty plain, and it's really windy. You see little dust tornadoes going everywhere, little dust devils, and but then also some really dramatic and interesting rock outcroppings. And so I've started learning what these are. And the three main soil types that we'll talk about is the basalt foundation from lava flows, again, those glacial floods, and then windblown loess. But first, the volcanoes. So about 15 million years ago is when the volcanoes along the Cascades were the most active, and all that rapid cooling from volcanic eruptions formed this basalt, this iron-rich, magnesium-rich rock as the foundation of Columbia Valley. So the Columbia Plateau, which is where most of the wine-growing regions are, has this basalt bedrock, this basalt foundation. And these, I mean, other than Mount St. Helens, there hasn't been much activity since. We are still around active volcanoes, so who knows what kind of ash or other activity we'll get. But the basalt is the crucial part here. But we only see it on some of the higher spots in the Yakima Valley or in Eastern Washington, because most everything below 1,200 feet was affected by the Missoula floods. So this was just a fascinating geological event in history. This is at the end of the last ice age, so about 15,000 years ago. There was an ice sheet, so the Cordilleran ice sheet, which you see up here, was retreating into Canada, but it formed an ice dam. So this plugged up the Clark Fork River in where now northern Idaho is, and it backed the river up into this huge lake. But then eventually, as the lake got bigger and bigger, and the stress on that dam got greater, the dam cracked, and it just flooded and flowed all the way through into Eastern Washington. And so what it did is it brought all this granitic and these other types of rocks, alluvial gravel and stone and silt from the Rockies, from that part of Idaho and Montana into Eastern Washington. And it all sort of settled, and the only place it could get to the Pacific was through this little area down here called Willow Gap. And you'll see a picture of it in a minute. But the gap wasn't big enough to let all the water out all at once, so it backed up and formed, all these lakes. I think they called it Lake Lewis or Lewis Lake. But your Yakima Valley is right here, so very much affected by Missoula floods. And eventually the water would drain through the Willow Gap down the Columbia River. It did go down into Willamette Valley, so into Oregon, and then eventually into the Pacific Ocean. And you might be thinking, like, how fast was this water moving? I was thinking how fast the water moved, or how much water was it? They say it was the combined, if you took all the rivers in the world and took the rate of flow of all the rivers and then multiplied by 10, that was the rate of flow of this flood. So you had a wall of water 400 feet high, moving at around 60 miles per hour, and that lasted for a couple weeks straight. And so that's how Lake Lewis emptied in. So just insane, just incredible flooding from this event. But it wasn't just one event. The Missoula floods is plural for a reason. This actually happened in around a 55-year cycle over and over again, a couple dozen times over a 2,000-year period. So that ice dam would reform, Lake Missoula would reform, and then it would break it again, flood through, go through the Willow Gap. And so we have all these levels and layers of silt deposits from the Missoula floods. Just fascinating. I think it's fascinating. And there's the picture of Willow Gap, by the way. So this is down on the Columbia River. It's really the only place in Eastern Washington where the water could have gone. And I think actually at the height of the floods, they say that the water was 80 feet above that. So 80 feet above what you see was where water was flowing over, but still most of it went down in between the gap. And so you'll see the red area on the map there is Columbia Valley AVA, and then the darker area is where Missoula flood silt deposits are in the soil. So it's not the entire area. And then it's also different based on what elevation you are. So like I said, it's only up to 1,200 feet elevation that you have Missoula flood deposits in the soil. Above that, you just have your basalt bedrock, and then on top of that, some less, or your wind-blown soil. So between the Missoula floods and now, again, it's very windy in eastern Washington, and the only kind of soil that can be blown by wind is very, very tiny particles. So this is the consistency of powdered sugar, low water holding potential, but it ends up being a good soil type for vines because it's very well draining and porous. And so that's all throughout Yakima Valley in eastern Washington. You have some combination of basalt, your glacial, Missoula floods up to 1,200 feet, and then wind blown less on top of that. So that was a quick little primer. That was your geography and geology thing. Now we get to talk more about Yakima specifically. So Yakima Valley AVA is located in Yakima County, just south of Yakima City, imagine that, which is the county seat. And all this is named after the Yakima tribe. So this was a Native American tribe that still there's a Yakima Indian reservation just south of the city that's still active. And the area, the AVA, the viticultural area, was approved in 1983, and it was actually the first appellation in the Pacific Northwest. So the very first appellation that was approved was in 1980. It was actually in Missouri. It was Augusta AVA, so not notable other than it's the fact that it was the first, whereas Napa Valley was the second in 1981. So this was still on the earlier side of when the U.S. was gaining in the wine game. But then eventually Yakima has been not split, but there's been sub-AVAs or different additions to the valley that have been set apart. So Red Mountain, Rattlesnake Hills, Snipes Mountain, which we've talked about a bit, and then Candy Mountain, which Pat was so nice to remind me last week that is a brand new AVA along with Royal Slope that was approved last year. So, and I think there's actually 3 or 4 more AVAs that are waiting for approval. So it's constantly changing, constantly defining these areas. In general, though, Yakima is one of the biggest producers of grapes in the state. So over a third of all of Washington vineyards are in Yakima, over 60 wineries. And it's also one of the most diverse wine growing regions because even in Yakima Valley, you have Red Mountain in the far east part of it. This was just a map to show you where it is in relation to everything else. So Seattle is here in the Puget Sound. Columbia Valley is this large sort of yellowish area, and Yakima is right here, right sort of in the middle, the southern middle part of the state. But we have our own map that we made that highlights some of the vineyards we actually work with here at Avennia. So this way, and I wish I could have gotten it bigger, but this way you can see where Yakima lies sort of geographically. So Red Mountain, like I said, here in the extreme western end is super hot. It's one of the warmest regions in Washington, whereas even all the way over here where Boucher is, where it pops up, it says Boucher, and then all the way to this side where Red Willow is, can be a little cooler depending on where you are, depending on your elevation. So we have a lot of diversity because you can grow some really nice Riesling and Chardonnay. You could, in Rattlesnake Hills up here, this is that sub-AVA, there's a lot of white wines too, and some north-facing slopes. And so there's just a lot of different grapes that are grown all throughout the valley. And let's see. And this, I don't know if this has been coined. I just put this is Washington's Fertile Crescent. Yakima is super important for all types of agriculture and all types of crops. Specifically, it's one of the largest producers of apples in the country. So 70% of all the apples in the nation are from Yakima. 42% of the nation's pears. It's the largest group of Concord grapes in the country. And then 75% of the nation's hops, the hop vine, which is used in beer production, is grown in Yakima, which also is 20% of the world's supply of hops. So hops is a very, very important crop there. And they're really fun. I don't know if you've ever seen hop plants and how they're planted, but they plant them on these bars with these strings sort of attached up to the top bar, and they grow in these little triangles or these little arches. And so you go during harvest and you just see these whole fields with these hop vines, and it's really fun, and it smells great. Unless you're allergic to it. I have a friend who's allergic to hops, and he has to stay away from Yakima in that part of the year. And then obviously a lot of other crops, vegetables, herbs, and other fruits are grown in Yakima. And now we're just going to do a very quick overview. This was kind of left over from last week when we talked about Washington wine pioneers. But this is the Yakima specific stuff. So again, 1869, the French immigrant Charles Chano planted the first cuttings, the first vineyard in Yakima. It wasn't until, the water rights and irrigation attorney William Bridgman planted vines at Harrison Hill and Upland Vineyard in Snipes Mountain that things got a little more serious. And then the irrigation experiment station was brought on board to see what other types of crops and grapes they could plant. Post-Prohibition, you had Walter Clore come on board and really start to guide growers all over the state on what to plant and how to grow really great grapes. Otis Harlan planted Cab there in 56. Associated Vintners, which we talked about last time, was formed in 62, and they plant and set up some of Harrison Hill Vineyard. This is a new addition, but I thought I'd mention it. In 75 is when John Williams and Jim Holmes planted the first vineyards on Red Mountain. So Red Mountain, it can be a whole other topic because it's a really fascinating place, a cool history. I didn't really want to get too much into it today because, we had the Missoula floods to talk about. But that happened in 75. In 79 is when Associated Vintners hires David Lake, who immediately starts just transforming the state. But he starts working with Mike Sauer, who was the grower at Red Willow. So before we get into Red Willow, a little more about David Lake, because, we had our grandfather of the Washington wine industry, who was Bridgman, and then Walter Clore was sort of the father. I think David Lake would be up there as some of the royalty of Washington winemakers and influencers. He was born in England, actually, to Canadian parents, and began working in the wine trade, but earned his Master of Wine certification in 75. He was actually the first, by the time he moved to the U.S., to study at UC Davis, he was the first winemaker in the U.S. to have that Master of Wine distinction, a really great honor. He ended up working with David Lett at Eyrie Vineyards in Oregon, which is interesting because that was also when Willamette in Oregon was going through their renaissance of winemaking. And it was David Lett that actually talked to Lloyd Woodburn and the group of professors at Associated Vintners to convince them, you should really hire this David Lake guy. He'd be great for you up in Washington. So that's when AV hired David Lake. And then he worked with Red Willow. He started consulting with growers and really helping progress some of the plantings. He was the first in the state to make vineyard designated wines, which we'll talk about in a second, and just had an incredible career at Columbia Winery. Unfortunately, though, he died relatively young. I think he was 66 when he passed away in 2009, but is still remembered. And there's actually a really cool wine that Eight Bells Winery produces called David's Block, and it's a wine from Red Willow that it's in honor of David Lake and everything he did at Red Willow. I haven't had a chance to try it yet, but I hope to soon because it sounds delicious. But Red Willow, I'm just going to talk about two vineyards here in Yakima. It's the two main vineyards we work with specifically, which is why I want to highlight them, but also because they have a lot of the history and the cachet for the Yakima Valley. So Red Willow started, as most vineyards did in Yakima, as a farm. So they grew potatoes and alfalfa since the 20s. But then Mike Sauer married into the family. It was Clyde Stevenson's grandson or granddaughter who Mike Sauer married, and started planting grapes. So he started with Concord grapes at that time. A couple years later, they officially called it Red Willow Vineyard. And that's when he met Walter Clore. So again, you have all these characters in the story who come back and influence each other. And Walter Clore helped guide him and plant a bunch of different varieties to see how they would do. And that's the same year he planted Cabernet, and with cuttings actually from Harrison Hill. So Cabernet vines from Harrison Hill Vineyard. And so over those years, they got a lot of things wrong. Some of the vines didn't take, but they also realized the best grapes came from the steeper hillsides from some of the poorer soils and things they didn't necessarily predict. And so as they planted more and more, they started using the hillsides more. And then so eventually they planted the first Syrah. Oh wait, let me go back. In 1980 or 1978, they signed a contract with Associated Vintners, and so now Mike Sauer and David Lake meet and start their relationship. And David was the one who got Mike and encouraged Mike to plant more things. And he really wanted to highlight Red Willow Vineyard and thought it was such a special place. So David Lake made the first vineyard designated Cabernet Sauvignon in 1981. He actually made 3 different Cabernets. There was Sagemore, the Otis Vineyard, and then Red Willow Vineyard. So it was one of the 3 first vineyard designated wines in Washington. And then kept working with Mike and got him to plant some new grapes. And Red Willow ended up being the first place that things like Syrah was planted in the state, which if you know Syrah in Washington now, it's a big deal. It's the 5th largest grape in production now. And so first one to plant Syrah in 1986 using cuttings from Joseph Phelps, which I think is fascinating if you know Phelps insignia and some of the wines down in Napa Valley. But also he was the first vineyard to plant Cab Franc, and David Lake was the first one to bottle it as a varietal. Viognier Mourvèdre, I think they also might have been the first to plant Nebbiolo and Barbera and experiment with those in bottlings. So they really just pushed the boundary and started doing some really cool things. And then I think it was 92, Mike Sauer went to Italy and toured Europe and got to know some European wine regions and realized that a lot of European vineyards had an identity and they had something that made them different. And so he thought that, he planted Syrah and had these steep hills, and he really liked the wines of Hermitage. And David Lake was the one who said, you know what, why don't you, this reminds me of Hermitage, you should put a chapel up on top of the hill. And so they started construction in 1993. And I also think it was a friend of Mike's who passed away that they dedicated the chapel to. But just it ended up being just such a cool spot. Again, that picture from the beginning of the slide with the little chapel that mimics the Hermitage chapel. And then it is the highest vineyard in Yakima Valley. So 1,300 feet is the highest part of the vineyard, which again is above that Missoula flood. So that's on your more basalt bedrock and wind-blown less. But then they plant on all parts of the hill. Oop. And then there's Mike. So that's just a picture of Mike Sauer with that 86 block of Syrah. That's the very first Syrah vines planted in the state of Washington. And then lastly here, we'll talk about Boucher Vineyard. So Dick Boucher was, I think actually he was planning on going into banking. He was just from a suburb of Tacoma, but his family had an apple farm in Yakima, so he went out to work. And he says that he planned on going out to work for a year. Stayed for about 4 years. He met his wife, who was also only supposed to be in Yakima Valley for a couple years, and they haven't left since. And it's a really good thing because he starts experimenting with grapes because, again, he meets Walter Clore. So Walter Clore pops up and talks Dick Boucher into trying out some vinifera varieties and planting wine grapes. So he plants mostly red, but also tried some Chenin for a few years before realizing no one really wanted Chenin Blanc. And so he ripped it up and really focused on red wine grapes throughout the 80s. But then he also planted Syrah in 94. And they actually used, I didn't even know this, and I've been selling Boucher Syrah now for a few years, but he actually got cuttings for that Syrah from Red Willow. So there's this line that connects all these moments in history in these vineyards, which is just awesome. And so that 94 planting of Syrah is actually something we source. We source the old block that he planted, and it goes into our Arnaud Syrah. But then he continues experimenting and planting. He eventually does get back into planting whites, specifically Rhone whites, though. He was one of the pioneers of a lot of the Rhone varieties, so Marsanne, Roussanne, Grenache Blanc, Picpoul, and just grows some really cool Rhone whites. He still is very active and grows more than just grapes. He grows apples, cherries. He's actually sat on the board of National Grape, which was the co-op that owns Welch's grape juice. So he has, I think he's on the board of the Washington State Wine Commission as well. So he has got his hands in a lot of things. And not only that, he manages other vineyards throughout Yakima. So he manages some vineyards on Red Mountain, some other ones close to his vineyard in near Grandview. But his Grandview vineyards are some of the cooler sites in Yakima, and especially from where we source from. And that's Dick. He's one of the most just pleasant human beings you'll ever meet, and just a fantastic grape grower. And then lastly, these are just, I wanted to highlight, these are the wines that we label as Yakima Valley wines. Our Olean, which comes from both Red Willow and Boucher. Justine, which is a Grenache Syrah Mourvedre blend, which actually comes from Upland Vineyard. Oldfield, which is Boucher manages right next to his vineyard, and then a vineyard on Red Mountain. And then Arnaud, which is a Boucher Syrah, and then Red Willow Cabernet, which is 100%, is from one block planted in 1985 that Mike Sauer planted at Red Willow. So that is my overview and history and little just part of Yakima Valley AVA. So happy Washington Wine Month, people. So let's see. So at this point, here we have an unrelated. I just wanted to say I had a chance to share my knowledge from your bottle theme session. Oh, cool. I was watching the chef show, and they were in Chianti using those rounded bottom bottles and the straw base, so I sounded smart. Yeah, Casey, that's my whole goal, is to try to help people sound smart when they're talking about wine. I hope that works for all of you. Sometimes I still don't sound smart when I talk about wine, so every time it happens, it's a win. But yeah, so if any of you have any questions about Yakima Valley, or just about that geography of Eastern Washington, climate, stuff like that, now would be a time if you're interested. But Jan asks, it sounds like there's not much organic matter in the soil. Is that correct? It is correct. I mean, there is some organic, because, especially in Yakima, the Yakima River is what the Yakima Valley is one of the other things the Yakima Valley is named after. But there is a river that runs through the valley, and so there is water there. And then again with irrigation, so there has been a lot of organic compounds. So because there's been other farming and other agriculture there, it's interesting. I was reading it wasn't an article, it was a science paper preparing about basalt. And they've done these studies about vineyards that have bare basalt rock in the vineyards versus grass cover. And you have more organic matter with vineyards that have grass cover between vines. But they're studying sort of, is there a benefit with having exposed rock because you have more heat radiating from the darker basalt color? Or do you need some more of that organic matter? Now, and this also can depend totally on vineyard, because you can plant things, you can introduce more organic matter by planting cover crops in between vines for different reasons, for introducing more nitrogen into the soil, or for other sort of sustainable biodynamic reasons. But in general, it's still, I think, there's a lower amount of organic matter than normal, fertile lands or other agriculture spots. So yeah. Yes, Robin.
Have you been to all the vineyards you get wines, grapes from, and how often do people at Avennia go and check on them during the season?
Good question. So I personally have been to Red Willow twice now, and I've been to Boucher once. And I've been to Red Mountain a couple times, but actually one of the times I went was with Chris, was with our winemaker when I was the harvest intern in 2017. But it was during the time when all the forest fires and all the smoke haze was settled over Yakima, and so we actually had to cut our trip short because we were gonna go see more of the vineyards, but the air quality was too bad. It was bad for breathing purposes, so I didn't see much. But throughout the year, Chris goes a few times during the off season, when grapes aren't growing, and just to touch base. He usually goes around now in March to touch base with a lot of his growers and talk about whether they want any changes in yields or canopy management, or just some ideas of like, hey, we're hoping to have a little more fruit this year. Is there a way to manage the vineyard in a way to make that happen? or just for other reasons. He was just in Walla Walla because we were bottling a wine, so I'm sure he maybe stopped at a vineyard at some point. But then during harvest, he goes out every couple of weeks, and then during during that final sort of ripening process, and then I remember sometimes he's going out every couple of days, or just like constantly driving back and forth to check on things, depending on the vintage. If the vintage is fine and there's no rain in the forecast or nothing you have to watch out for, then he's a little less worried and might not make the trip as often. But and then our whole team did a trip out to the vineyards that we sourced from a couple of summers ago, so that our tasting room staff and everyone could see what each of these vineyards were like. So, although I will say I think Red Willow is probably the most fun vineyard to visit, just because it is such a cool space, a cool spot. You had the chapel; it's just beautiful. And the last time I was there, there's still wild horses that roam on the hills surrounding Red Willow, and again, Horse Heaven Hills, which is one of the AVAs in the southern part of Washington. Part of the reason it was named that is because there are wild horses still that roam those hills. So I got to see wild horses, which was pretty neat. And it's a beautiful spot. And the sours are just delightful. So we're lucky we get to work with some really great people.
You talked a little bit about, cover crops and things like that, about, I'm just curious with the soil compositions, are these vineyards doing regular kind of adding things to the soil for, what kind of regular care do they take of these soils, and how does that differ depending on either, the person doing the managing or the altitude?
I think that's a great question, and because I think it so depends on the vineyard manager, and their philosophy on how they want to manage the vineyard, whether they're plowing, or whether they're doing cover crops. A lot of times, I know a lot of, or I don't know a lot, but I've heard that many vineyard managers or growers also just have a lot of patience, and sometimes they'll want to see how a vineyard does for a few years, or how a certain plants or certain vines are, you can do so much studying of a site, whether it's measuring soil health, whether pH and chemistry, but also physical properties, so water retention, drainage, things like that in the soil. You can kind of make your best guess on that using data and lab analysis. But a lot of times you kind of just have to go for it and plant some vines, and then see how it reacts to your mesoclimate or your microclimate in that specific spot. But it's a good question. I'll dig a little deeper and see if there's specific things that might be more broadly accepted by growers in Yakima or Eastern Washington that might not be in other places, or if it still is very much producer to producer or manager to manager. So yeah, I'm not sure. Casey says, how important are the clippings to the final grape profile versus soil, climate, etc.? And then part two, since these famous Washington Syrah sites, Red Willow and Boucher, came from California, when replanting comes around, do they try different vines? Oh, that's both great questions. So, and I think you mean by clippings, you mean the the original cuttings or the original plants that they plant in the ground. The final grape profile is definitely affected by the cuttings, because the cuttings are going to be of a certain clone, or usually they are a certain clone, and the reason you're getting that clone or that particular kind of Syrah, say, is because it has proven to work in a certain way, whether it's better for drought resistant, or it's better in a different type of soil that has higher pH or lower pH. There's a whole bunch of different reasons why you would choose a specific cutting or a specific clone of to plant and try. Sometimes it's just whatever cuttings you can get your hands on. If you're planting a vineyard and you have a connection with another grower and they're like, you know what, I got some great Syrah vines and you should take some cuttings and plant them. So it definitely can affect the final grape or the final wine profile, but you're right, so will the climate, so will all those other decisions that are part of terroir. So it's just one of the many factors that goes into that final grape. And then as far as when replanting comes around, do they try different vines? That's a good question, and I know that they are replanting things, all the time. The Red Willow Cabernet, so that bottle that was on the right of the last slide I showed, was specifically from one block. It's from the 1985 plantings of Cabernet at Red Willow, and unfortunately, they had to rip out those vines in 2019. So it just got to the point where there was leaf roll virus, which was a situation in the plant that causes the leaves to roll, so you don't get as much photosynthesis. And it basically just lowers the yield of the plant. It doesn't really affect the quality of the grapes or the wine. It just lowers your yields to the point where it's not economic to keep it going. So I think that was what happened with the 85 block. And so I think that they are replanting, but I'm not sure if he's replanting cab in the same spot, or if he's gonna do a different clone, or different things. And a lot of times when you do replant, it's an opportunity to see where the market is and how tastes have evolved generally. Because if you rip out old Cabernet vines and all of a sudden Grenache is or some other variety is really hip, or there's a lot more people are drinking white wine, or they want specific flavors. I mean, you might choose different varieties or different clones based on what's happening in the world. So, but I'll look into that as well, because now I'm curious of what Red Willow is doing with that area. Yeah. These are great questions, though. Yeah.
Eli, is Yakima a wine drinking area? Do tourists come and drink wine, or is it only growing?
That's a good question. A little bit. So there's like the little towns. Prosser is one of the little towns in the Yakima Valley that has some tasting rooms, and it has a little village that is kind of is trying to promote more wineries. Red Mountain too there are a bunch of wineries on Red Mountain that you can go visit, and it's a cool site. They have a great tasting room, but in general, it's not as much of a tourist destination as say Walla Walla. I think Walla Walla, because it has a larger town, it's a larger city or town. There's more restaurants, hotels. It's hard. Yakima, it's pretty barren. I mean, other than the few little towns and cities, like it's desert and farmland. So as far as a tourist destination, you have to be a wine geek. So like I love going to Yakima because I just geek out on all the cool, like Snipes Mountain, and then you're like, there's Harrison Hill, but it's not. They haven't really designed it as a tourist destination. Whereas now here in Woodinville, we've decided, like, because of Chateau Ste. Michelle and Columbia Winery and a lot of the places set up in Woodinville, we've decided almost that this is where the tourists should come, because it's easier to fly into Seattle and come over to Woodinville to taste wine and to learn about wines, as opposed to flying into the Tri-Cities or Portland, or some of the other places, and just to get to Yakima. So. Yeah. I'm looking at my Arnaud bottle, and it says unfined. What does that mean? Good question, Tiffany. So unfined, the fining process. So it's one of the ways that you can remove impurities or remove sediment or things from a wine before bottling. So you have filtration. You can filter a wine, and you have fining. And filtration is what you think it is, where you pass the wine through some filter, and it can trap particles of a certain size, and pass it through. But a lot of times it'll strip away other things you don't want to lose from the wine, because there's a lot of little compounds and tannins and molecules that you still want in the wine that the filter could trap. Fining is another way to do a similar thing, and it's the process of adding a protein into the wine. And then the protein molecules end up binding into, so it's a similar type of thing. It binds onto sediment and particles in the wine that would make it cloudy, and it binds to the point where they get too big, and then they'll drop out, similar to any sort of sediment that polymerizes and gets too big. There's different fining agents you can use. So a really common is egg whites. So the protein in the egg whites can do that. Bentonites, which is a clay that they've used. So I don't even know if it's not necessarily a protein thing, but it's another fining agent. Isinglass, which I think is sturgeon bladder. It's from sturgeon, from a fish. Is used in fining. I know, right? So this, and it's one of the reasons why, if you ever hear the term vegan wine, it's usually in reference to if they're using egg whites or isinglass or something as fining agents. And so you want to make, if the wine doesn't have animal product in it. Side note, I think vegan wine is also really tricky because if you knew how many spiders and bugs we kill and like things in the grape bins and other animals who are harmed during the making of this product, you wouldn't be happy. But yeah, but that's the fining process. And you would do that. I'm not actually sure. It's done before bottling, but with enough time to let things settle, and then you would rack the wine off of that sediment that has those proteins or that fining agent in it. So yeah, we with all the Avennia red wines, they're all unfined and unfiltered. So you can be really careful when racking, and racking again is the process of moving the wine through pipes into another vessel. So when we have our barrels and they have some sediment in the bottom, some lees or whatever, we have this special wand. It's called a racking wand, and so it's a pipe you put down into the barrel, but it leaves a little space at the bottom, so it doesn't take any of the wine from the very bottom where the sediment is. Instead, it sucks the wine out from right above it, and that's how you can move the wine into another vessel, clean the barrel out, and pump the wine back in. And that's how we try to remove sediment or remove those impurities to make the wine look clearer. But to us, clarity in wine isn't as important, because the other thing you lose when you use fining and filtration is sometimes some of the flavors and aromas that you want. You want some of those, that essence of the wine. We do filter our whites, so that's one of the exceptions. We do filter the whites just because we want them to look professional in their bottle, because it's a lighter bottle. A lot of wineries will filter whites, but we don't find them. So, but yeah, but all the reds are unfined and unfiltered. But now I have to fact check that too, because I'm pretty sure that's all correct, but I didn't prep on fining today. That's all right. Well, any other questions? Anything at all about Yakima or anything? This has been fun. It's actually fun for me to prep and learn about Washington wine stuff, because honestly, that's what I should be learning about anyway, because I have to sell this wine and we make our wine in Yakima. So it's really nice that I get to do that. But yeah, so, and I don't know if you had a chance to see, we did post the next 2 months, which I teased to you last week, of all the topics we'll be doing. The last thing we're doing this month is next week, and I'll give you a warning ahead of time. There's going to be a lot less wine stuff next week and a lot more music stuff. So one of the things, our winemaker Chris Peterson, is going to join me, and for the last few releases, he's paired albums or music with the wines that we're releasing. And I've done a similar thing in both the opera world and just pairing wine with music. And it's kind of a fun exercise to think of wine in a different way. So we're literally going to just sit, we're going to talk. We'll present a couple pairings that we've thought about ahead of time with specifically Washington music groups, so Washington bands and artists, and pairing their music with our wines. But I'm hoping it could also be a discussion. So this is also an opportunity, if you have friends or siblings or members of your family that kind of like wine, but they really like music, or they really like jazz or grunge or anything, this could be a fun discussion for those folks too. So it won't be as intimidatingly like wine knowledge the whole time. It'll be a fun little detour. So yeah. And it is a question. Do you have a go-to food restaurant when you visit Yakima area? Oh, that's a good question. I feel like there's the only restaurant I've been to was in Yakima City, which the city is just north of the actual valley, of the actual AVA. I want to say it was Cowiche Canyon. Is that familiar to Donna? I think I'm saying that right. Cowiche Canyon. restaurant. Yeah, which was I thought was great. Honestly, though, most of the time that I've gone, it's the couple times I've actually eaten at a winery. So whether it was with the Hedges on Red Mountain, or being hosted in different places, or we just end up going to breweries. So we went to Breakside or breweries and get hoppy beer, and then just do that instead of eating. So, but I do want to check it out more and explore and see if you guys have any recommendations of restaurants or places to check out when you visit Yakima. Let me know, because I'd like to know. So beer counts, good. Awesome. Well, that's great. Well, thank you all so much for coming back and for learning some stuff and chatting about wine. Like I said, we'll do music next week. The week after that is going to be the wine fraud and sour grapes. I was so bummed because Sour Grapes was streaming on Netflix and it's not anymore. So you can still watch it. You can rent it for like 99 cents, I think, on Amazon Prime. And there's some other ways you can watch the movie. So if you haven't watched it and you want to watch it, feel free to do that. And we'll talk about that movie a little bit in 2 weeks. But other than that, I hope all of you are well and enjoying March so far. I hope you all get vaccines and we get out of this as soon as we can. And I'll see you around next week. So this time, if you wanna unmute and say hello or say goodbye, I always like hearing all your voices. So thanks everyone.
See you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.